Look at Boeing's own website and the planes they are currently making right now. The only line of planes being sold today that wasn't mentioned as problematic in these hearings is the 767 line, which makes up only 1.5% of their orders this year. Put another way, Congress is being told that 98.5% of Boeing's commercial airplanes are being manufactured in ways that increase the danger to all of us passengers.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, my friend, and thank you for listening to the 296th episode of the listener-supported Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. And today is the long-awaited episode about Boeing, a company whose safety standards, or lack thereof, safeguard or risk the lives of millions of humans every single day. And lately, Boeing's safety record has been concerning, which is why Congress has been investigating Boeing for years. And here's just a small taste of the things that Boeing has done lately. So in late 2018 and early 2019, less than 6 months apart, two brand new Boeing 737-8 MAX airplanes fell out of the sky and killed 346 people. Then on January 5th of this year, 2024, a panel called a door plug on a Boeing 737 MAX 9. A door plug is placed in a location inside of the plane where a door could be installed but wasn't. Well, that door plug flew right off the plane mid-flight. Then in March, just a couple months after that, after a Boeing 777 took off from San Francisco, a wheel fell off of the plane and shattered a parked car's window in the SFO employee parking lot. And then during the week of this recording in mid-July 2024, that happened again. A wheel fell off of a Boeing 757 flight after a plane took off from LAX in Los Angeles, and the pilots didn't even notice. But thank God some people on the ground noticed the wheel bouncing down the runway. Someone even filmed it and told the pilots so that they could prepare for an emergency landing in Denver. And also, this very week, the Federal Aviation Administration ordered 2,600 Boeing 737 airplanes to be inspected because the Federal Aviation Administration has evidence that the passenger oxygen masks could fail during an emergency. Lately, it seems like every couple of days, there's news about problems with a Boeing product. And so today, I'm going to share with you recent testimony to Congress about what is going on at Boeing, with most of the testimony focusing on the two airplane crashes in 2018 and 2019, the door flying off of the plane in January, and concerns about other lines of Boeing planes that haven't turned into major disasters just yet. But Boeing whistleblowers are voicing very serious concerns. For this episode, just so you understand the format, I have weaved the testimony from all of the hearings together so that we can follow storylines through the course of all of the hearings. And if you want to check my work or get more information, the links to all of the full hearings I watched for this episode are in the show notes, including links to a couple of hearings that I watched but didn't include any sound clips from. There have been a lot of hearings on this topic. But in the show notes, you will see links to, I want to say 6 or 7 hearings. And if you want to go down the full rabbit hole, like I know our producer Chad and the surprisingly large number of pilots in the Congressional Dish community probably will, well, you can also find the links to all of the documents mentioned and all of the information that we used to research this episode in the show notes. And if you value having a source for information that proves what it says to you and makes fact-checking easy, please pay for this show. You can find all the methods for paying for this show on the Support the Show page on congressionaldish.com. But I do need to apologize to you because the one thing that you're not going to find in the show notes for this episode are timestamps for all of the sound clips. Because I tried a new editing method that I thought would speed up the process of making this episode, and it totally backfired. It did not work at all, and I won't do it again. But one of the consequences of my experiment is that we have no timestamps. But I can tell you that the vast majority of the testimony that you're going to hear pieces of today is coming from 3 of the hearings. The first hearing took place in March, on March 6, 2024 to be exact, in the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. And you actually already heard some testimony from this fascinating hearing in episode number 293, which was about the National Transportation Safety Board's transportation safety warnings. But in the March hearing, featuring testimony from NTSB Administrator Jennifer Homendy, whose job it is to investigate transportation-related accidents, that is where we're learning a lot of the information about that door flying off from the Alaska Airlines flight back in January. And then the other two main hearings for today took place in the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, and in the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation again. Both of those committees held hearings at the same exact time on April 17, 2024. One of the hearings featured whistleblowers from inside Boeing and the Federal Aviation Administration. And the other hearing featured a panel of experts who had just spent months of their lives studying Boeing's safety inspection procedures and writing a report for Congress. And I do just have to say, I can't help myself, that it does seem weird to me that these two committees had hearings at the same time when information from both of the hearings could have and probably would have informed the other. But whatever. I've never accused this particular Congress of having foresight or being efficient. But anyway, I also have a clip, or maybe two, I can't remember, from a hearing that happened just a few weeks ago on June 13th, 2024 in the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation, where the new FAA administrator, so the guy in charge of the airplane police, he was asked to testify. And then finally, I have no clips at all from the hearing that is also in the show notes that took place on June 18th in the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, which featured David Calhoun, who's someone who left his job at Blackstone, the investment firm, to become the CEO of Boeing in January of 2020, and who spent most of the hearing acting like he knew absolutely nothing about the company that he's paid tens of millions of dollars per year to manage. You know, over the years of producing Congressional Dish, I've learned that in general, in congressional testimony, there is no one worth less than a multinational corporation CEO. But for this episode, I did watch approximately 20 hours of testimony, and I'm presenting you with all of the best parts so that you don't have to burn 20 hours of your time. And if that is valuable to you, please pay for Congressional Dish. Unlike corporate media, we are not funded by Boeing or any other corporations, which is why we can and do share this kind of information with you. But this is not a lucrative business model. In fact, over the last 14 months, we've netted only 12 new patrons on Patreon. And as grateful as I am for every single person who is paying for this show already, without whom I would have quit this a long time ago, this stagnation is kind of making me feel like a loser. And so please support the show if you aren't already. I know that this business model is not a path to riches, and that's not what I'm asking for. And I'm happy with the choice that I made so that I can have total editorial independence. But inflation is hitting me too, and I need at least some growth to keep doing this. And so please contribute what you can. Okay, enough of that. I really hate having to do that every episode. And so let's get into the good stuff. Or the bad stuff, depending on how you look at it. But let's get into the Boeing stuff. So Boeing is a multinational corporation that describes itself as a company that, quote, develops, manufactures, and services commercial airplanes, defense products, and space systems for customers in more than 150 countries, unquote. And Boeing is causing dangerous situations in all of the sectors that it specializes in. Now, today we're going to focus on the commercial airplanes part of their business, but I do feel like I have to at least mention their recent actions in the so-called defense and space system sectors. In terms of war, Boeing is a corporate monster, quite literally. The darkest, scariest part of its existence is the part that creates sophisticated weapons designed to cause mass death. For example, Boeing was in the news recently because the Israeli military used a Boeing bomb on a group of people sleeping in tents in Rafah in southern Gaza, killing 45 people. Boeing has also been in the news lately because we Americans have apparently privatized our space program, and a Boeing-manufactured space shuttle delivered U.S. astronauts to the International Space Station last month. Now, the mission itself, which was Boeing's first time launching U.S. astronauts into space, was years overdue because of software problems that Boeing should have discovered during the manufacturing stages, but didn't. The astronauts were simply lucky that the defects that could have killed them were caught during testing that was done before the shuttle was loaded with human beings. But the luck of the astronauts is being tested once again, because 2 of our astronauts are stuck on the International Space Station indefinitely because of technical problems with their Boeing manufactured spaceships that I don't understand well enough to explain and don't particularly care to learn right now. But the point here is that astronauts who were supposed to be home by now are still in space because of Boeing manufacturing screw-ups. Boeing is a problem, and Congress knows it because Congress has been investigating it. But Congress is also enabling Boeing and has been for a very long time. About a third of Boeing's business comes directly from the U.S. government, as in from our tax money, which is doled out by Congress. And our government's reliance on Boeing for war and now space exploration makes it a too integrated in government to fail type of business. You may remember from the CARES Act episode that in that emergency situation when COVID was just starting, our Congress made sure to provide $17 billion specifically for Boeing. Although, Boeing didn't end up taking the money because they didn't want to follow the CARES Act rules that came attached to the money. Rules that said that Boeing couldn't use our money to buy back their own stock, pay their executives loads in bonuses, or lay off a bunch of their workers. Boeing wanted to do all of those things, and so they left our tax money on the table. But the congressional intent was there. As the country was being shut down due to an unprecedented public health problem, the corporate moles in our Congress made sure to save Boeing before they all scattered home to hide from the virus and hide from their responsibilities to the nation. And I'm sure that had absolutely nothing to do with the fact that Boeing tends to spend $12 to $15 million a year lately to pay for more than 100 slick-tongued DC trolls to schmooze around Capitol Hill on their behalf. Now, those slick-tongued trolls are referred to as lobbyists in DC speak, but Boeing has over 100 of them, and 5 of them are former members of Congress. And so, just for funsies, let's name those former congressional dickheads who are cashing in on their public service, the guys who are now getting paid to talk their former coworkers into going easy on and funding a criminal company whose negligence is actively hurting people. Boeing's current lobbyists include former Democratic Party Representative Norm Dix of Washington's 6th District, former Republican Party Representative Jack Kingston of Georgia, former Democratic Party Representative turned Senator John Breaux of Louisiana. Boeing also is paying former Democratic Party Representative and former House Minority Leader Dick Gephardt of Missouri. And Boeing is currently paying former Republican Party Representative turned Senator Trent Lott of Mississippi, who you may remember as the former Senate Majority Leader. The former House Minority Leader and former Senate Majority Leader are both Boeing lobbyists, meaning that many of the House Democrats and Republican senators who are still serving in this Congress were led by these guys, who are now in Congress giving them the old hawk tuah on behalf of Boeing. Boeing is heard in this Congress. Boeing is paid by Congress, and Boeing is roundabout paying members of Congress right back. Because individuals associated with Boeing have already passed out well over $1 million to members of Congress for this upcoming election, and it's only July. Boeing is a powerful company that is kind of integrated with our government, our War Department in particular, which we should keep in mind as we eavesdrop on Congress's investigation of Boeing's commercial division, and as we judge the consequences it's been dealt for its deadly behavior. When it comes to Boeing's commercial airline business, which is the part of Boeing that most of us probably think of when we think of them at all, because those are the airplanes that we ride. Well, in that business, Boeing is one half of the world's passenger airplane duopoly. While there are a few smaller companies trying to bust into the business, there are really only 2 companies that absolutely dominate the global passenger airplane market, and that is Airbus and Boeing. Boeing, the much older of the 2 companies, has been creating airplanes since 1916. And for a fun little description, complete with some old-timey newsreel audio describing how Boeing became a behemoth in commercial passenger airplane production, I'm going to play for you a small piece of a great little 20-minute documentary produced by Bloomberg in 2020. The full version of the documentary is in the show notes for you, and it's called How Boeing Lost Its Way.
Boeing's history goes back over a century, and while its early seaplanes weren't iconic, by World War II, their military aircraft were.
When news of a successful raid by the Flying Fortresses comes in, these are the people who get the biggest thrill, the thousands of Boeing workers who build them.
Boeing's an American manufacturing icon. It was churning out bombers that were critical to the Allied defense effort and gave us Rosie the Riveter, sort of a symbol of American can-do culture.
Employers find that women can do many jobs as well as men, some jobs better.
They were one of the great survivors of the post-World War II shakedown in aircraft design and the most successful new entrant in the new jetliner market of the late 1950s.
The company gambled everything on a prototype of what became its first jetliner, the Boeing 707.
Nearing completion in the Boeing plant at Seattle, America's first jet transport is a unit of glistening beauty.
That was followed by the 727 and built this revolutionary behemoth, the 747. You probably know it for the hump behind the nose. And at the same time, they came up with what became Boeing's greatest commercial success, and that was the 737.
The 737 wasn't immediately successful. It took several design and engineering iterations to turn it into the plane that we see today.
It became a workhorse for airlines, like Southwest, that fly primarily shorter routes and really brought travel to everyday people.
And millions of us fly on various versions of the Boeing 737 every single day. But there are some big problems with the most recent versions of the 737, which became horrifically obvious when two brand new Boeing 737 MAX 8 airplanes fell out of the sky. Lion Air Flight 610 crashed into the ocean 13 minutes after takeoff in Indonesia on October 29, 2018. And then, a few months later, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 crashed 6 minutes after takeoff on March 10, 2019. In total, 346 people were killed. 346 people who could have been any one of us. They were just on the unlucky flights. But after those crashes, it became clear that both planes went down in similar accidents. Both crashes were caused by the same software, and you'll hear testimony about this in a few minutes. But after that discovery, that both crashes were caused by the same thing, the Federal Aviation Administration ordered all 737 MAX 8 airplanes grounded for 20 months, while there was an investigation into the causes of the crashes, and while Boeing was forced to fix all of the problems. Or, at least that's what I feel I was led to believe was going on. But on January 5th, 2024, there was another accident involving a 737 MAX, this time a 737 MAX 9 operated by Alaska Airlines with 171 human beings on board. Shortly after takeoff on a flight that was supposed to carry humans from Portland, Oregon to Ontario, California, a door plug, which is a refrigerator-sized panel on the side of an airplane where a door can be installed, but in this case wasn't. Well, a door plug that is essentially invisible to the passengers flew off the plane while the plane and all of its humans were about 16,000 feet above the ground. Now, luckily, the people who are supposed to be sitting in the row where a human-sized hole appeared in the side of the plane had missed their flight. And so miraculously, that row was empty, and the plane was able to safely circle back and land safely in Portland with no one dying. But this accident easily could have killed people. And before the door plug flew off, both United and Alaska Airlines, which are the only U.S. airlines that are currently flying 737 MAX 9 airplanes, had both previously reported that they found loose door plug hardware and bolts that needed to be tightened on the 737 MAX 9 airplanes that had been delivered to them by Boeing. The National Transportation Safety Board, which has been investigating the causes of the accident since it's happened at the beginning of this year, and Jennifer Homendy, who's the chair of the National Transportation Safety Board, or NTSB as I'll refer to it from now on for short, well, she testified to the Senate about their investigation on March 6th, about 2 months after the accident. Here are some highlights of her March 6th testimony, along with some questions from Senator Ted Cruz about the Alaska Airlines hole-in-a-plane incident. And after her testimony, you're going to hear information from testimony to Congress given about 5 weeks later to the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations by Ed Pearson, who is a former Boeing manager turned whistleblower.
There were 154 flights in total that had occurred. And so we could see at the top of that door plug how that door plug was migrating upwards until it finally came out on the 154th flight. We asked for security camera footage. Renton has security cameras all over the facility. We asked for security camera footage so we can understand who did the work.
What's the explanation for why you haven't received that information from Boeing or Spirit? I guess it's Boeing in this case.
We have not gotten a good answer. We have either not gotten an answer, or they're saying they're trying to provide it but can't find it. On the security camera footage, all their security camera footage is erased within 30 days and overwritten. Boeing has not provided us with the documents and information that we have requested numerous times over the past few months, specifically with respect to opening, closing, and removal of the door, and the team that does that work at the Renton facility.
Wow. Are you telling us that even 2 months later, you still do not know who actually opened the door plug?
That's correct, Senator. We don't know, and it's not for lack of trying. It's not unusual that we don't get information immediately in an investigation. I can point to numerous investigations where this occurs, and it takes months and months to get information. But for this one, it's 2 months later. We know for a fact that there is a team that deals with the doors in Renton. There's an entire team of 25 people and a manager. The manager has been out on medical leave. We've not been able to interview that individual. We've asked for the names of the other 25 people, have not received the names. We've asked for the records with respect to what occurred. We've asked for what shift it occurred on. We think we know what days the work occurred on, but that's only because of our investigators' work looking at pictures and emails to try to get to the bottom of that information. We don't have the records. We don't have the names of the 25 people that is in charge of doing that work in that facility. It's absurd that 2 months later, we don't have that.
Mr. Pearson is a former senior manager and the current executive director of the Foundation for Aviation Safety. He spent 10 years at Boeing and oversaw teams who manufactured Boeing's 737 MAX airplanes.
The NTSB chair reiterated to Congress last week that Boeing has said there are no records documenting the removal of the Alaska Airlines door. I'm not going to sugarcoat this. This is a criminal cover-up. Records do, in fact, exist. I know this because I've personally passed them to the FBI.
So Boeing isn't cooperating with government investigators. And this is not the first time. This is a part of a pattern that Congress and the Justice Department has been well aware of for years because of Boeing's behavior during the investigation into the 737-8 MAX crashes in 2018 and 2019. Like I said before, Boeing is one of the two duopolistic companies that make damn near every commercial jet that the big airlines buy and on which we fly. In 2011, Airbus came out with a fuel-efficient airplane. And if you are the driver of a fossil fuel chugger, you are probably painfully aware that gas is expensive. Well, that's especially true for airlines whose planes chug being technical here, a metric ton of gas. And so Airbus being able to offer a fuel-efficient plane was an obvious advantage because buying Airbus planes would save the airlines money. American Airlines, an important Boeing customer, did in fact decide to make the switch to Airbus in 2014, and the executives at Boeing freaked out. And so Boeing set about making a fuel-efficient plane. And they did it. Technologically, this was not a problem. But they didn't want Airbus to have any competitive advantage. And the Airbus fuel-efficient plane was so close to its old model that it didn't require any additional pilot training. And so that became a Boeing goal too. And so with these goals in mind, Boeing developed the 737 MAX line of planes, which they successfully made more fuel efficient, and they were able to do it by upgrading their existing 737 models instead of designing a whole new plane. And the FAA approved the 737 MAX line of airplanes with the knowledge it was given by Boeing about the new MAX version. And the FAA thought that the new version was similar enough to older models that minimal pilot training would be necessary. because training requirements are determined at levels lettered A through E, with level A being the least amount of training required and therefore the least expensive, and level E requiring the most training and therefore costing the company the most money. And the FAA determined that the switch to the 737 MAX required a relatively inexpensive level B of new training for pilots. Level B would allow pilots to complete their training from anywhere in the world in a few hours using a computer or an iPad. But the two Boeing employees who were responsible for giving the FAA the information it needed to make that determination left some very important information out. Information about the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, which you will hear referred to as MCAS. MCAS is a new automated flight control system that automatically steers the plane. It would automatically push the airplane's nose down in some circumstances, when the nose being angled up too high could cause a stall and therefore a crash. But a decision was made to have MCAS controlled by only a single sensor, an AOA, or angle of attack sensor. That sensor is basically a little piece of metal that sticks out of the side of the plane, near the front, kind of under where the pilots sit. And if anything were to damage that sensor, a bird or a balloon, or if it just didn't work for some reason, then the MCAS system could be triggered to steer the plane towards the ground for no reason. And if this happened, the pilots would have 10 seconds maximum to respond, or the plane would crash. Having a single point of failure like this, having one sensor in charge of such a critical function, to be technical about it, is a stupid thing to do. But no pilots complained because Boeing didn't tell anyone. They didn't tell the FAA nor the pilots that this powerful new MCAS system was on the plane. Boeing chose to keep the MCAS system secret because had they given the FAA all of the information about MCAS, the FAA would have required level D training for pilots, which would have required in-person training inside of a flight simulator, which would have required airlines to buy flight simulators and also to pay double for pilots to fly while other pilots completed their training. Airbus's fuel-efficient upgrade didn't require that training, and so if Boeing did require more training, airlines may have chosen to buy Airbus planes instead. And so Boeing hid the information about MCAS so that they could tell customers that the switch to their planes would only require cheap and easy level B training instead of expensive level D training. But that decision, that fraud, led to the deaths of hundreds of people. Because when the pilots of Lion Air Flight 610 took off in Indonesia and the nose of their planes were repeatedly pushed down for seemingly no reason, because they weren't trained on the new system, they had no idea what to do. And after that crash, Boeing blamed the pilots for the crash, essentially saying that they were bad foreign pilots who weren't trained properly. But after it became clear, which happened quite quickly, that MCAS was involved in the Lion Air crash, Boeing finally told pilots about the new system, and pilots were given instructions to turn the MCAS system off if they encountered a similar situation. And so, when the pilots of Ethiopian Air Flight 302 took off, and their plane's nose was being pushed down for seemingly no reason, they turned off the MCAS system. But the plane was already descending too fast, and they crashed anyway. Those pilots did exactly what they were supposed to do, but they and everyone on their plane died. And Boeing again publicly blamed the foreignness of the pilots for the crashes. And after that second crash, which happened during the "let businesses be free" Trump administration, the FAA didn't automatically ground the airplanes. Our FAA only acted after China first grounded the 737-8 MAX, followed by many other countries. Our regulators during the Trump administration were going to let Boeing keep selling the planes and let the airlines keep flying them, while Boeing figured out how to fix a problem that had already killed 346 people. And diving into politics and opinion zone for a second, when I think about the possibility of a second Trump administration, I'm not afraid of the end of democracy or the world's tackiest dictatorship. I'm afraid of this. I'm afraid of our government being once again staffed by corporate moles who will refuse to facilitate government doing its corporate policing jobs, instead allowing big businesses to risk our lives in pursuit of profit. That's what the Trump FAA did under the leadership of Mitch McConnell's wife as Secretary of Transportation in 2018 and 2019. But anyway, back to Boeing. Boeing hid MCAS from the pilots and the FAA so that Boeing could save money. That's what happened in those crashes, which is backstory which will help you to truly understand the testimony you are about to hear. And here's the other thing you need to know. You need to know what an ODA is. ODA stands for an Organization Delegation Authorization, or as I think of it, an offensive dereliction of authority, because it's basically self-policing permission. In the 1920s, Congress gave the Federal Aviation Administration, the airplane police, the ability to delegate some of its policing responsibilities. In reality, that has meant that the FAA delegates authority to private companies to perform oversight tasks of themselves, tasks that typically would be performed by an FAA regulator. And that permission was expanded about 20 years ago when in 2005, during the privatization-loving George W. Bush administration, when they changed the FAA regulations to allow companies to not only inspect, but to certify the safety of their own products. No outside inspections required. And with that regulatory change, allowing private companies to certify the safety of their own products, the Organization Delegation Authorization, the ODA program, was born. Since 2009 and continuing today, as a part of the ODA program, employees of Boeing are approved by the FAA to certify when a plane is or is not safe to fly. For the last 15 years, because of ODA, Boeing has essentially been permitted to police itself. And so now that you're in the know, here's some testimony from Ed Pearson. He's the former Boeing manager turned whistleblower and current executive director of the Foundation for Aviation Safety. Then you'll hear from Joe Jacobson, who is a former Boeing employee and then former FAA certification engineer. And then you'll hear from Senator Tammy Duckworth. And it's going to sound like she's testifying because she kind of is. And usually I don't include speeches or testimony from members of Congress, but Senator Tammy Duckworth is a pilot who flew helicopters in the U.S. Army. And as a pilot, her information and opinion is actually valuable here. Then you'll hear from Sean Prishnicki, who is an engineering professor at The Ohio State University, and he's going to be speaking to Senator Ron Johnson. But starting us off, here's former Boeing manager Ed Pearson.
I've done everything I can to continue telling the world the MAX airplane is still unsafe and to alert authorities to Boeing's dangerous manufacturing. I'm here today to share 4 key messages. First, the manufacturing conditions that led to the 2 737 MAX disasters also led to the Alaskan blowout accident, and these conditions continue. In 2019, I testified as a Boeing whistleblower.
And here's some of his testimony from 2019.
My name is Ed Pearson. I retired from the Boeing company in August of 2018 as a senior manager at the 737 factory in Renton, Washington. On June 9th, 2018, while the Lion Air airplane was being produced 4 months before it crashed, I wrote an email to the 737 general manager advising him to shut down the production line to allow our team time to regroup so we could safely finish the planes. During this time frame, the 737 factory was in chaos. Every single factory health metric was getting record low marks, and each one was trending in the wrong direction. Following that email, I requested a one-on-one meeting with the general manager on July 18th and repeated my recommendation to shut down the factory for a brief period of time. When I mentioned that I've seen operations in the military shut down for lesser safety concerns, I will never forget his response, which was, the military isn't a profit-making organization. Keep in mind that on October 29, 2018, when the Lion airplane crashed, killing 189 people, it was only 2 months old. After the crash, I wrote a letter directly to Boeing's chairman, president, and CEO, Dennis Muhlenberg. Mr. Muhlenberg asked his general counsel to communicate with me, and we spoke on 3 occasions where I renewed my warnings. On February 14, 2019, the Boeing's assistant general counsel assured me that Boeing had seen nothing that would suggest the existence of embedded quality or safety issues. I wrote a follow-up letter with supporting documentation to Boeing's board of directors requesting that they take urgent action, but received no response. Less than a month later, on March 10, 2019, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 crashed, killing 157 people. That airplane was only 4 months old.
And now let's go back to 2024.
My name is Joe Jacobson. I'm an aerospace engineer with almost 40 years of experience. I worked for Boeing from 1984 to 1995 on the 767 and 777 programs. From 1995 to 2021, I worked in aircraft certification at the FAA. I retired from the FAA in 2021 and have been volunteering as an independent aviation safety advocate since, mostly in support of the ET-302 families. On November 6, 2018, a week after the Lion Air 610 crash, I received an email from a colleague asking if we had done any issue papers on MCAS. This was the first day that I heard about MCAS. The next day, although not assigned to the crash investigation, I received an email from a colleague at the FAA which contained flight data recorder information from the Lion Air crash. It was immediately obvious to me that the 737 MAX had a serious design flaw. I saw that the horizontal stabilizer was repeatedly moving at a high rate because of a faulty angle of attack input. I guessed that a software error was responsible. A few days later, I was shocked to discover that the airplane was purposely designed and certified to use just one AOA input for this flight critical function. When the House report was released in September of 2020, I finally understood why I hadn't known about MCAS. Boeing meeting minutes from June 2013 recorded the reason, saying, if we emphasize MCAS as a new function, there may be a greater certification and training impact. Boeing intentionally hid the design from FAA engineers and airline pilots. Had we known, at least a half dozen experienced FAA engineers in the Seattle office would have immediately rejected the original MCAS design. Boeing concealment led to 2 crashes and 346 deaths.
As a pilot, I cannot convey strongly enough how critical it is for the flight crew to be fully informed of the features on the flight deck. An in-flight emergency is not the time for a flight crew to first learn about something like this. And then also, as we saw with MCAS, pilots not knowing about a flight deck feature can be deadly. This is even more alarming considering that this is the third time that Boeing has kept information about MAX flight deck features from pilots. And the FAA in the past has let Boeing get away with it the first 2 times. This has become a dangerous pattern which FAA absolutely needs to break. At the start of the MAX program, Boeing removed MCAS from the flight manual with FAA's blessing. Subsequent investigations raised questions about how candid Boeing had been with FAA about the significance of MCAS. Despite this, when evidence emerged of an internal plan at Boeing to intentionally downplay the significance of MCAS to a regular, FAA did not investigate. So they reduced the significance of MCAS to just a regular concern. These are internal Boeing, so I have my poster here, which is the internal email within Boeing itself that says this. These are internal Boeing meeting minutes showing employees planning to not use the term MCAS outside of Boeing because, and I quote, if we emphasize MCAS as a new function, there may be greater certification and training impact, end quote. They also show a member of Boeing's Organizational Designation Authority, the ODA, approving this plan. Yet, FAA took no action in response to this evidence. According to the Department of Transportation Inspector General, FAA did not even consider finding out who this ODA unit member was to ensure that he or she was not still authorized to perform certification work on behalf of the FAA.
I'm an assistant professor in both integrated systems engineering and the Center for Aviation Studies at The Ohio State University. Prior to teaching at Ohio State, I was an airline pilot. During my time teaching at the university, I earned my PhD in cognitive systems engineering. Look, we've been dancing around an issue here that, quite frankly, being a systems engineer, I design a lot of automation and the interaction between human and automation. And what they did is quite obvious. They snuck the MCAS system through the certification process. Period. It's that simple. But they did that over money, sir.
Is that or was that criminal? Again, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a prosecutor. Is that criminal? Do we have laws on the books?
I can't answer
that type of What's the right word?
I
Not
know-
evasion. I mean, was that criminal behavior? Should somebody been held liable criminally?
I can't answer if that's criminal, but as a cognitive engineer, I can tell, and I know how the certification process works, and I know how this accident works. They snuck it through the process, and it was all about money. It was all about getting those airplanes to Southwest, and it was all about money, and that's why those people died.
And that has been confirmed as fact by the Justice Department. In January of 2021, the Justice Department made a deal with Boeing that basically said that Boeing would not be prosecuted for that fraud. Boeing would face no criminal consequences for sneaking the MCAS system past the FAA certification process, as long as Boeing took some actions to fix their problems as outlined in the agreement. This agreement is called a deferred prosecution. It's basically corporate probation. And as part of the deferred prosecution agreement, Boeing had to admit to some facts, including that Boeing purposefully hid the changed MCAS design from engineers and pilots so that they wouldn't have to pay for additional pilot training. So it was, in fact, a financial decision. And on top of that, Boeing admitted that it refused to cooperate with the investigation for 6 whole months. Despite this admitted fraud and non-cooperation, the deferred prosecution agreement allowed Boeing to get out of being prosecuted as a criminal entity, and Boeing had to pay a criminal penalty fine of $243,600,000, which even the deferred prosecution agreement described as, quote, at the low end of the otherwise applicable sentencing guidelines fine range, unquote. Boeing also had to pay about $2.2 billion to the families of the victims. But as a part of that agreement, Boeing agreed to, quote, cooperate fully with other domestic or foreign law enforcement and regulatory authorities and agencies in any investigation of the company, unquote. And as you just heard from NTSB Administrator Homendy, Boeing is not cooperating in the investigation into the door falling off incident in January. And members of Congress in both parties seem pissed about it. Here's Senator Ron Johnson, a Republican, speaking to ex-Boeing manager turned whistleblower Ed Pearson, followed by Senator Richard Blumenthal, a Democrat.
The deferred prosecution agreement being made public, or is that sealed?
I'm not aware if it's been made or not.
It has been made public, Senator, and it's an absolute, probably the most embarrassing thing in my career I've seen is how those families were treated. And that deferred prosecution agreement should never have happened. It was absolutely criminal that they did that. It was just heart-wrenching.
So who's in charge of that deferred prosecution? Who agreed to that?
That's the Department of Justice.
Let me just intervene, since I am a former United States attorney and a federal prosecutor. The Department of Justice deferred prosecution agreement is public. In fact, I was very critical of it at the time it was reached. And I've urged since then that the Department of Justice investigate whether, in fact, it has been violated. And I think the ranking member raises a very pertinent and important question. Mr. Pearson has raised it as well. He's presented evidence that the Department of Justice should consider through the FBI. We have brought to the Department of Justice's attention evidence that should be considered. They're going to have to make a judgment. We can't, because we're not prosecutors. We want the Department of Justice to take this evidence and other facts that it has obtained to examine the deferred prosecution agreement, whether conditions of that agreement have been violated, whether criminal prosecution is appropriate.
And the Justice Department did investigate and found that Boeing did violate that agreement. And so right now, Boeing is in the process of pleading guilty to fraud for deceiving the FAA in their MCAS certification runaround scheme. Now, the deal with the Justice Department isn't totally done yet, and we don't know all of the details. But what we do know is that this plea deal would make Boeing an official criminal organization. Now, in U.S. law, the U.S. government isn't supposed to give contracts to companies that are convicted of felonies. And considering contracts with the U.S. government make up at least a third of Boeing's business, this would be a big hit to Boeing, possibly a big enough hit to get Boeing to change its profit over safety behavior. But there are loopholes in our law that I think will get Boeing out of this kind of trouble, because there are waivers that the Secretary of Defense and other agencies are allowed to issue to criminal companies if they say there is no other company that can provide the product or service. Boeing is, as we already discussed, one half of a duopoly. It's Boeing or Airbus. And Airbus is a foreign company while Boeing is the only domestic one. And so the waiver pretty much writes itself. And so I see no accountability for Boeing in terms of losing contracts in my crystal ball. I hope I'm wrong. And with this plea agreement, if it's followed through on, an existentially large financial punishment won't happen either, because Boeing is reportedly only going to be fined another $243.6 million. That's the same amount as they paid as a part of the deferred prosecution agreement, bringing their total criminal penalty to less than $500 million. Now, for you or I, $500 million sounds like a lot of money, but it's not that much money to Boeing. For example, in the years that all of this was going on, from 2012 until the first crash year of 2018, Boeing purchased $90 billion worth of its own stock, which drives up the stock price, which drives up the wealth of shareholders who do no work whatsoever for the company, and for the executives who are often paid in company stock. $90 billion is how much money Boeing had left over from all of their cost cutting to throw into the stock market casino. But they are fined $500 million when we know that that excess money was partially collected due to the fraud that killed 346 people and risked countless more lives. That $90 billion in extra money was made during those years that these crimes were being committed, and yet they are set to be fined less than 0.5% of that. And so no wonder Boeing's stock price went up after this plea agreement was announced, because there is nothing punitive about that fine at all. And then as far as physical punishment goes, well, no human from Boeing will serve any time in a cage because the Trump Justice Department's deferred prosecution agreement actually shielded the executives from personally being liable for any of this, regardless of what new information may come to light. And you can't cage a corporation, so no prison time for anyone is on the table. And so the closest the Justice Department can come to physical punishment is supervision. In this case, the plea agreement would force Boeing to be inspected by an independent monitor for 3 whole years. But Boeing would get to choose the candidates for that independent monitor position. Boeing would get to help choose its own babysitter. And Boeing would be spared the scandal that would come if the testimony that you are hearing today was heard by a much wider audience during a media-attended trial. And of course, this is pissing off a lot of the families of the victims. They want a trial. They want the world to know what Boeing did and for the company to be punished severely for the deaths that they have caused, and the danger their negligence continues to pose to all of us who fly. And when I look at this absurdly Boeing-friendly deal, I can't help but wonder if Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco, the second most powerful person in the Justice Department right now, had something to do with arranging for an amazing deal for her former client. Because before getting her current extremely powerful gig at the Justice Department, Lisa Monaco was a corporate lawyer who was paid to help Boeing stay out of legal trouble. But regardless of if that corporate mole had anything to do with it, and I have no proof that she did, but just the fact that she's there is icky. But this deal is beyond amazing for Boeing. It is barely a slap on the wrist for a company that could afford to buy $90 billion of its own stock while taking the shortcuts that cost 346 lives. And the victims' families are furious, as they should be. But their fury didn't matter to the Justice Department when the deferred prosecution happened during the Trump administration. And so will their fury matter this time? Well, that depends on U.S. District Court Judge Reed O'Connor of Texas. It's all up to him. If he gives his stamp of approval to this sweet deal, it's done. And I will feel no safer flying the friendly skies. Because not only will it prove that Boeing faces no existential threat to its profits or existence if it criminally kills people, but the testimony in Congress is proving that Boeing's safety problems go beyond the MCAS system, and the problems go beyond the 737 MAX line. But before we get to those, let's take a closer look at the 737 MAX line, which was out of service for 20 months, and which, until watching these hearings, I was under the impression would be the safest planes in the sky because, after all, they had all of that scrutiny for 20 months, and so I assumed all the fixes were made. Well, here's Senator Ron Johnson of Ohio speaking to Boeing whistleblowers Ed Pearson and Joe Jacobson. And then we're going to time warp back to the NTSB administrator hearing where Senator and pilot Tammy Duckworth will talk to NTSB Administrator Jennifer Homendy about the 737 MAX problems. And again, just to remind you what it is, you're going to hear about the AOA alert, which stands for Angle of Attack Alert. That's the alert connected to the one MCAS triggering sensor. The AOA alert tells pilots that the one sensor connected to the MCAS system doesn't like where the nose is headed and is going to steer the plane in the down direction all on its own. And then after that, we're going to come back to our Boeing whistleblowers.
First of all, I want some clarity. Was it or was it not the MCAS system that caused that crash?
The MCAS system, Senator, was obviously played a significant role. So did the lack of pilot training. But as Mr. Jacobson has said, there was other factors, and our analysis, my analysis, shows that those airplanes also had manufacturing defects that triggered the MCAS software.
Mr. Jacobson?
Yeah.
So what were those other defects? I mean, was it the sensor? I mean, only having one sensor was part of that system, though. But
well, the sensor. As Mr. Pearson has talked about, the sensor showed problems. The original sensor on the Lion Air airplane showed a lot of manufacturing defects when it was examined. What I found curious was after the Ethiopian crash, they said the sensor was taken off by a bird. They had no evidence for that, none whatsoever, but they concluded that it was the bird that did it. And so I think it's much more plausible and likely that it was an electrical fault of some sort, either arcing or something like that. Well, the truth is it's more than one thing, right? It's the entire system. You have to look at manufacturing. You have to look at also at the design. Since the MAX has gone back into service, this is the list of manufacturing. These are unsafe conditions that are identified by the FAA in the manufacturing area. Engine anti-ice, exhaust duct fasteners, compromised seal and adhesion within the center fuel tank, loose bolts in the rudder assembly, stuck rudder pedals, misinstalled electrical wire bundles in the wing spoilers, and then, of course, the door blowout was also a manufacturing defect. So we have a long list of unsafe conditions from manufacturing defects. We also have a long list, equally long list of design defects. So what that tells me is it's a company-wide problem. It's not.
So the MAX was taken out of service for how long? Quite some time, right?
20 months.
20 months. And again, the public, I was certainly hoping, assuming that 20 months they were able to correct those defects, that they did install more of the indicators, right? So they somewhat fixed that problem? I mean, are all these other problems completely unaddressed, not fixed?
There were many problems that were unaddressed. The crew alerting system is the big one. That one was not addressed. That contributed to the crashes. The pilots had a lot of false indications going off, which delays their response, and they're trying to figure out what's going on. In the meantime, the stabilizer is running and the nose is running down. So it's a combination of things that need to be addressed.
Boeing also intentionally hid from pilots the fact that the AOA disagree alert on nearly 80% of Boeing 737 MAX 8 aircraft was not functioning. When Boeing discovered this defect, it did not report it to FAA or inform airlines or pilots, opting instead to keep it a secret. Keep producing planes with this same known defect and wait years to fix it until a planned software update in the future. Boeing's plan was disrupted, however, when the first 737 MAX crashed in 2018 and worldwide attention began to focus on AOA sensors. The company was forced to admit that the AOA disagree alert was not functioning on most 737 airplanes and that they knew about it. Unlike MCAS, this was not a safety-related issue. However, this was a clear violation of the MAX's approved flight design. And this is a finding from the U.S. Department of Transportation Office of the Inspector General. DOT's Inspector General recently looked into this and said, and I quote, "All features included in the type design are mandatory, whether or not they are required for safety. Thus, while the disagree message was not necessary to meet FAA safety regulations, it was required to be installed and functional as part of the approved type design," end quote. Yet, FAA took no action against Boeing for this brazen, intentional, and repeated disregard of its approved type design. If FAA is not going to bother to enforce its own regulations, why would Boeing ever obey them? So, Chair Homendy, Here are my questions. Would you agree that, as a matter of safety, pilots need to know what features are on the flight deck?
Absolutely. It is a matter of safety. They need to be fully informed and fully informed so they know what to expect.
Thank you. Would you also agree that it is dangerous for pilots to first learn about features on the flight deck during an in-flight emergency?
Yes, and I would extend that to the entire flight crew, including the cabin crew. One member in this particular flight was hit by the door as it blew out. There was a lot going on at the time. It was complete chaos. They need to know what to expect, and this was a complete surprise.
Thank you.
During the recertification of the MAX, FAA leadership supported Boeing's effort to narrow the scope to primarily focus on MCAS. MCAS was a mess for sure, but other critical items were off the re-examination table. The MAX crew alerting system doesn't meet current design requirements, and by my count, the old standard has contributed to 8 fatal crashes of Boeing aircraft and 885 deaths since 1996. Despite this dismal safety record, in July 2022, Boeing Chief Safety Officer Mike Delaney stated, "I personally have no belief that there's any value in changing the 737. CEO Dave Calhoun lobbied further and said, "This is a risk I'm willing to take. If I lose the fight, I lose the fight." Boeing lobbying efforts ultimately succeeded. The grandfathered design of this MAX leaves many vulnerabilities. When combined with the failure to investigate the manufacturing chaos identified nearly 6 years ago by Ed Pearson, this has led to a predictable but still shocking list of unsafe conditions.
If the leaders of those government authorities, government agencies had done their jobs, investigators would have uncovered a mountain of important information. The FAA would have known Boeing's production processes were a mess and the safety culture was terrible. The FAA could have prevented an ever-increasing list of production quality defects. Instead, they're surprised each time it occurs, showing how ineffective and reactive their oversight has become. Just last month, the FAA reported on uncommanded rolls of MAX airplanes due to wiring that is being chafed. Boeing and the FAA have known about these manufacturing defects for more than 2 years and did not inform the public about this potentially catastrophic condition. There are also Canadian reports of new MAX airplanes with chafed wire bundles containing burn marks and evidence of electrical arcing.
We did an analysis, and in Alaska Airplanes, we did it, and we published this thing in September 2023. They had 53 brand new MAX airplanes. We found over 1,200 aircraft system malfunction reports that they had submitted to the FAA, 1,200 on 53 brand new planes within 2 years old. And I'm not talking tray tables or headrests. I'm talking the systems that Mr. Jacobson has been talking about. So we need to make sure that those things are investigated and resolved, and that are supposed to be. Boeing routinely states that their airplanes meet or exceed all safety standards. This is untrue and misrepresents the safety of the airplanes. The company illegally removed thousands of quality control inspections on individual airplanes without the FAA's knowledge and without the knowledge of the airlines. Although many of these inspections have been reinstated, hundreds of airplanes have left Boeing factories without those thousands of inspections. The world is shocked to learn about Boeing's current production quality issues. I'm not surprised because nothing changed after the 2 crashes. There was no accountability. Not a single person from Boeing went to jail. Hundreds of people died, and there's been no justice. Unless action is taken and leaders are held accountable, every person stepping aboard a Boeing airplane is at risk.
So that's the testimony about the 737 MAX line of planes. But the testimony went beyond those planes, which have gotten damn near all the scrutiny since the 2 crashes and the door plug blowout were all on 737 MAX planes. But Congress took testimony from another Boeing whistleblower who was working on not 1, but 2 other Boeing airplane lines. Sam Salapore is a current employee at Boeing, but he's not just any employee. He's a quality engineer, meaning that it is his job to look for, find, and flag defects that need to be fixed. He's an important person in the Boeing safety system. And here's his testimony about what he has seen at Boeing. In this testimony montage, you are going to hear first from Sam Salapore of Boeing, and then he will respond to some questions posed by Senator Roger Marshall of Kansas and Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri. Then you're going to hear some testimony from the same day down the hall from the expert panel who completed a report to Congress about Boeing. Specifically, you're going to hear from Dr. Javier de Luis, who works in the Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics at MIT. And then we will end with engineering professor Sean Prushnicki from The Ohio State University.
My name is Sam Solopur, and I'm a quality engineer at the Boeing. I went to quality about 3-4 years ago, and when you put your quality hat, we are the eyes and ears of the public for the safety of the airplane. That's how I feel about our job. And so I have, when I see concerning information or concerning, let's say, production issues, then it is our responsibility to make sure that, if we are causing the airplane to have increased risk factors, our job is to eliminate those risk factors. I have over 40 years of experience as an engineer. I'm not here today because I want to be here. I'm here today because I felt that I must come forward because I do not want to see another 787. I do not want to see 787 or 777 crash. I have serious concerns about the safety of the 787 and 777 aircraft, and I'm willing to take on professional risk to talk about them. First, little bit about me. I came to the United States in 1973 and got a mechanical engineering degree from University of Missouri, where Senator Hawley is from. After that, I worked for companies that they were involved in the space shuttle. I had a friend, engineer, that worked on the space shuttle. He was always complaining about the quality of the O-rings that we had in the space shuttle Sauraraka boosters. He was scared that they might fail. He raised his concerns, and he was heard, and he wasn't heard. And 7 brave astronauts, including the teacher in space, died when the Challenger O-rings ultimately failed, just as he predicted. At the moment, I know that if I were ever in a similar situation, I would have to come up and speak up. I have analyzed Boeing's own data to conclude that the company is taking manufacturing shortcuts on the 787 program that may significantly reduce the airplane safety and the life cycle. Since 2013, there have been serious issues on the 787 program, not properly closing thousands of gaps in its assembly of the fuselage on major joints. Boeing's standard says that these gaps must be closed, usually by a small shim or filler called a shim when they exceed 0.005 of an inch. This seems very small. Boeing's PR team like to call it the width of a human hair when you are operating at 35,000 feet. Details are that the size of a human hair can be a matter of life and death. In a rush to address its bottlenecks in production, Boeing hit problems pushing pieces together with excessive force to make them appear that the gaps don't exist, even though they exist. The gap didn't actually go away, and this may result in premature fatigue failure. They are using significant excessive force to squash the gaps before you measure it. If you squash in the gap before you measure it, you don't know what you're getting, because the purpose of that is to measure the gap in its free state. When you squash that with excessive force, basically you're getting false information. If you get the gap measured falsely, you are not going to shim it properly, and it's a danger to the airplane. It's very, very important. Boeing has put out reports that they say that they can lose almost 80% of the airplane life cycle if we don't follow these protocols.
I want to try to understand this. The diagram that you all supplied us, this is a Boeing 787.
Yes.
And you're talking about where these joints come together.
Yes, I'm talking about the one on the most forward between, right there, and one in the aft. That's a 4143. No, the one this way.
This one,
right.
Between that and the nose.
That's a 4143. It's a major joint. And then one on the aft.
So instead of shimming them, they're basically just using force to bring them together, and you're concerned that it hurts the composite.
Well, it just violates every one of our common practices. because you don't force stuff together, because when you force stuff together, you increase the stress concentration on that. If you think of a paper clip, if you bend it back and forth, after a little while it breaks.
Yeah.
Effectively, they are putting out defective airplanes. I repeatedly produced reports for my supervisors and Boeing management demonstrating that the gaps in the 787 not being properly measured or shimmed in two major joints of the 787. Evaluating from the 29 inspected airplane data, I found gaps exceeding the specification that were not properly addressed 98.7% of the time. I want to repeat that. 98.7% of the time, the gaps that they were supposed to be shimmed, they were not shimmed. The other issue that I found, when you have these gaps and you drill through them, you get some debris in the stack-ups. This is known to be a problem, not a good thing for the airplanes by Boeing. But Boeing data also, from the inspection of the data, shows that the debris ended up in the gaps 80% of the time. Again, you have debris in the gaps 80% of the time. I want to make clear that I have raised these issues over 3 years. I was ignored. I was told not to create delays. I was told, frankly, to shut up. At one point, Boeing management got sick of me and raising these issues and moved me out of the 787 program into the 777 program. On the 777 program, I found problems. Again, I found that Boeing started a new process to build the airplane without taking into the consideration of the design of the airplane and how the airplane was designed. As a result, I witnessed severe misalignment when the planes were assembled. Boeing manufacturing used unmeasured and unlimited amount of force to correct the misalignment. And this also weakens the airplane in the long run. I literally saw people jumping on the pieces of the airplane to get them to align. I call it the Tarzan effect, among other improper methods. We have made over 300 plus airplanes. We still don't know how to put the load and sell. What I mean by that, if you build in an airplane, build in a house, it's like, putting the foundation. We have made over 300 airplanes. We still changing our process, like build the foundation to put the airplanes. We are struggling with that because they have changed the process, from stable to unstable situation. They're not building the same datums that we were building. So you're causing your own problem, but you don't want to admit it. Just force fit the problem, force fit the misaligned holes and everything else and move on. And that's what they have been doing. And that's what I have brought up to their attention. Ever since the space shuttle O-rings, that has really put a mark on me. That thing should not have happened, but it happened because of the faulty engineering. And that's exactly what we have here, is we have faulty engineering that, they're trying to shove on our throats to just say, hey, whatever we do, it's okay.
Are these planes safe?
Right now, I would not. It's like an earthquake. The big earthquake is coming, but when that hits, the building that, let's say if you're talking of a building, have to be prepared to accommodate that type of a, let's say, shakeup. It has to be built properly. Right now, from what I've seen, the airplanes are not being built per spec and per requirement.
So your testimony is the 787 line and the 777, the 777 line, are you think are not?
Well, they are doing stuff that increases the risk factors. Okay, when you increase the risk factors, it's not just one. You are doing stress concentrations. That those stress concentrations, like breaking a paper clip, you do it once or twice, it doesn't break, but it breaks at some time. As the plane gets older, all of these things that you took, you said it's not a safety issue, it becomes a safety issue.
The car industry learned this a long time ago, right? You don't let cars move forward when they have defects. You fix the defect and you figure out why the defect's there, and then it doesn't show up again. That's not happening here. When problems arise on the line, the line keeps moving forward. And I think that until they take a page from from what the U.S. auto industry learned 30 or 40 years ago, we're not going to be able to get to where we need to be for Boeing.
Let me be clear. When you try to increase productivity without the needed resources and being guided by poor management with only financial focus and the lack of assembly line inspectors, you are always borrowing from safety. You cannot have both.
And it seems clear to me that borrowing from safety is a habit at Boeing, because Congress is being told that they are borrowing from safety on the 737 line, the 787 line, and the 77 line of airplanes. Look at Boeing's own website and the planes they are currently making right now. The only line of planes being sold today that wasn't mentioned as problematic in these hearings is the 767 line, which makes up only 1.5% of their orders this year. Put another way, Congress is being told that 98.5% of Boeing's commercial airplanes are being manufactured in ways that increase the danger to all of us passengers. And while the focus of these hearings was rightfully on Boeing, because they are the company in charge of the overall manufacturing process, there are other companies involved in the manufacturing of Boeing airplanes. At least now there are. Because Boeing used to manufacture the entire plane in-house back when Boeing was known as being the gold standard of airplane manufacturing and safety. But starting with the 787, things changed. This is another segment of the Bloomberg documentary called How Boeing Lost Its Way, which again, you can find the full documentary in this episode's show notes.
For the 787, Boeing attempted a new system for designing the aircraft. Instead of doing everything in-house, it would outsource much of the plane's design and manufacturing to its biggest suppliers.
It was going to be about outsourcing to the places where we could produce things more cheaply, as opposed to the finest, best, safest airplanes in the world, which is what Boeing made for decades.
This works for running shoes, ladies' garments, cell phones, hard drives, integrated circuits. It works for everybody. It'll work for you. And I thought, no, it won't.
Boeing had never done a plane using this system before. This was very different from, Boeing controlling the processes itself. And it did not go well.
We launched the 787. The worst I could think of was that we'd be 3 months late, which is a shooting offense at Boeing. It wasn't 3 months late, it was 3 years late. It wasn't $5 billion over budget, it was 30 or 40 or $50 billion over budget. Grounded the fleet for 3 months.
The suppliers, were just in over their heads, most of them. We had years of issues. There was an engine explosion at one point. There was an electrical fire on a flight test aircraft.
And I thought, okay, this experiment is done, right? This didn't work. And the executive said, the business model is fine, we just didn't execute it.
And Congress is being told that not much has changed. In the following series of clips, you're going to hear first from Senator Raphael Warnock of Georgia, questioning Dr. Nahideen Meshkati, a professor of aviation safety and security at USC, about the 787 line of planes on April 17th. Then we're going to time warp back to March and listen to a conversation between Senator Jerry Moran of Kansas and NTSB Administrator Jennifer Homendy as they discuss the 737 MAX 9 door plug blowout. And before you listen to this, you should know that the physical work of creating the fuselage, which is the part of the plane that we sit in, and therefore the door plug assembly on 737 MAX 9 airplanes, that had been outsourced by Boeing to another company, Spirit Aerosystems, which is not to be confused with Spirit Airlines, which is not the same thing and has nothing to do with this. But Spirit Aerosystems creates the main cabin of the Boeing planes in Wichita, Kansas, and then ships the main cabin by rail to Boeing in Renton, Washington, where the rest of the parts from other companies are gathered for final assembly at Boeing's main facility. So to get us started, here's Senator Warnock talking to Dr. Meshkati.
Dr. Meshkati, yes or no, can a manufacturer subcontracted by Boeing, such as Spirit Aerosystems, assign manufacturer responsibilities to an international affiliate in Malaysia, for example?
787 is now made all over the world. Wings in one country, the other wing in another country, fuselage in another country, they are doing that.
Let me ask you about what you said about the three subcontractors. Those are subcontractors of Spirit Aerosystem?
That's correct.
And that became known It was thought that Spirit Aerosystem actual employees were doing work which turns out to be being done by subcontractors of Spirit. Is that
That's correct. That's correct.
And are
With
you-
3 different entities for the 3 different people
Are you
we
missing
interviewed.
information in regard to that circumstance?
We are not at this time. It was a surprise to us that we were not told before being contacted by the individual employees that they were contractors and who they were contractors for. But we don't have other information that is missing right now from Spirit Aerospace, to my knowledge.
So we have a chain of outsourcing going on. Boeing outsources the work to other companies who will do the work cheaper than Boeing employees will. And then those companies are outsourcing the work too. Remember, if you're old like me, the game Telephone, where us kids would line up and a person on one end of the line would whisper a sentence into the ear of the person next to them, who would then repeat it to the person next to them, who would repeat it to the person next to them, and so on, until the person at the end then said the sentence out loud? Well, the reason this game was fun was because the sentence that came out at the end of the line was pretty much never the same sentence that the first person started with. Ha ha ha, fun for all. But Boeing is playing a similar game with airplane manufacturing, expecting a perfect game of telephone to be played, but with safety standards being passed from company to company. Obviously, the game is going about as well as we learned it would back in kindergarten. And maybe this could work if there was a strict safety inspection process. But here's the most famous consumer safety advocate probably in the world, Ralph Nader, speaking at an aircraft maintenance outsourcing summit on June 4th, 2019, right after the second 737 MAX 8 plane crash.
Have you not heard that Boeing is in the process of laying off almost 1,000 quality control inspectors in Washington State and in South Carolina? Why? The quality control inspectors asked. Boeing answers, because automation can do it better, cheaper, and quicker than the human eye and the human brain.
And the quality control inspectors that they did keep, such as Sam Salapur, well, here he is testifying to how Boeing has reacted to him doing his job by reporting safety concerns and doing it well. In this sequence of testimony, you're going to hear Salapur discuss his experience with Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri and Senator Maggie Hassan of New Hampshire. And at the end, you are going to hear from Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut.
My understanding is you worked on both the 787 and the 7777, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you identified major safety concerns with both of these lines, shall
Yes,
I say.
sir.
And you identified these to your superiors.
Yes, sir. I have written many memos time after time that we can provide.
Over a period of years, I think.
Yeah, this is like 3 years. For the 787, it's been 3 years of effort.
And so your concerns, who knew about your concerns? How far up the chain do you know that they went?
I have gone as high as Mark Stockton and Lisa Fall, who's the vice president.
The vice president of the company? Yes. So they were and are aware of these major safety concerns.
Can you describe the internal Boeing culture around reporting safety and quality concerns?
Right now, basically, I have very, negative attitude towards the quality concern. When I bring something to my boss to say, we have problems with this, and he prevents me from even documenting and prevents me from even sending the information to the SMEs, the subject matter experts, to me, that's a problem. A quality manager telling you not to write your concerns and not to send it to the subject matter expert to just, let's say, I don't know for sure. They close a gap of like 3/4 of an inch without shim. That's concerning. Yeah. Our rules are 010. So I said, I want to write that. Well, don't send it. I told my boss that, I said in the report, I said, we have made 300 plus airplanes. That should have been more than adequate for us to resolve these things. All the problems that we've had, we put Band-Aid over Band-Aid to resolve the problems, and Band-Aid over Band-Aid doesn't cover it. Maybe we need to consider some engineering fundamentals with a little bit of GD&T to figure out what the problem is. And right after that, he came back to my desk and he He, like I said, he made the threat, and then after that he says, "Are you in or are you out?"
Meaning what? Are you in and are you out with Boeing? I mean, are you going to be a good citizen and keep your mouth shut? Was that the implication?
That's how I can interpret that. He would walk by me and he said, "You better." Then he said, "I want you to write it in writing. Tell me, are you in or are you out?"
Put it in writing whether or not you were going to.
I'm in or out, and what that means, are you going to just shut up?
Right.
That's all.
That would be in. If you wanted to be in, you needed to be quiet. You needed to stop this. Don't say anything more. Certainly, don't tell the public.
That's how I interpreted it. But he told me to write it in writing, and I'm trying to write it. And there was 10 emails. Just because I haven't received your email on this, send it to me, and this and that.
So then he's pressuring you.
Then he's pressuring you, and then his manipulation even got further than that. I'm trying to take a class on my own time that I have to flex the time. He wouldn't let me do that. I have a doctor's appointment. He cancels my doctor appointment at the same day. Different manipulating different things to retaliate, to make your life miserable. And then, I started talking to go somewhere else. You just try to escape from that because this is hell, that I was subjected to. And then he threatens you with that. And really, with my background, I've had some, it's really has made me where 3 o'clock in the morning, I'm waking up with somebody stabbing me. I'm still receiving psychological help to just get back on normal.
So not only were you discouraged and really told not to document it, what's your impression of how comfortable other Boeing personnel are with raising their concerns to management, both before and after you came forward?
Well, I think it's very negative. It's really, they think that, like we had situation where they had debris in the gap, and my friend put some inspections in there, and the boss was telling him that, are you trying to stop the production? Those are significant problems that, if you don't inspect, you have to inspect to get a good quality airplanes out. Right. And what I'm trying to say is the attitude at Boeing from the highest level is just to push the defective parts regardless of what it is, unfortunately.
Since this hearing was announced, our subcommittee has received outreach from other individuals affiliated with Boeing who have contacted us to voice their concerns. For example, a former Boeing South Carolina manager wrote to us with examples of what he described as, quote, culture of shortcuts, pressure, and hostility that he experienced while working at Boeing between 2009 and 2020. Another Boeing mechanic who asked to remain anonymous wrote to us and said, quote, the Boeing South Carolina plant was run by a good old boy network that played by their own rules. When we raised concerns that the work was not in accordance with the process and procedures, we were ordered to just do it and told there were hundreds of others waiting in line outside the gate wanting our jobs. And tragically, last month, John Barnett, a former Boeing quality control manager in South Carolina, who became a whistleblower, committed suicide after alleging that managers had been pressuring workers not to document defects and properly address safety risks.
John Barnett's suicide. A suicide that's become a meme because, well, it's about as believable as Jeffrey Epstein's. John Barnett was a Boeing quality engineer. He had essentially the same job as Sam Salapur, and he reported that he was pressured by management to not document defects he discovered in the manufacturing process so that production could continue. Some of the things that Barnett discovered and was told to hide were mechanics stealing parts off of one airplane and installing them on other airplanes without any documentation. He discovered that Boeing was allowing mechanics to inspect and improve their own work in violation of FAA regulations. He discovered that some passenger oxygen bottles weren't working in emergency situations. And he discovered debris inside of gaps in the airplanes, debris that could trigger electrical shorts if not cleaned up. And when he refused to follow the orders to let all of this go, he was given low performance reviews and was transferred to another unit. Does any of this sound familiar? After being driven from the company in 2017, taking an early retirement, John Barnett then sued Boeing. And in the days before his death, he was testifying against Boeing in court. But that lawsuit is settled now because John Barnett was found with a gunshot wound to the head in his car in his hotel parking lot. The coroner ruled his death a suicide. How lucky for Boeing. And I don't know what really happened to John Barnett, but when Sam Salapore, a quality engineer just like Barnett was, says he has nightmares about being killed, I can understand why. And I can understand why other whistleblowers are afraid too. Whistleblowers like Santiago Paredes, who is a quality engineer at Spirit AeroSystems, who repeatedly warned about quality control problems with the Boeing parts they were manufacturing for Boeing, and who was subsequently demoted. There are whistleblowers, dozens of them, who are in various stages of reporting problems at all levels of Boeing manufacturing. And the big picture was described in the hearing with the expert panel who studied Boeing and who wrote the report for Congress in April. This is testimony from Dr. Javier De Luis, the MIT lecturer from the Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics, who had studied Boeing in the aftermath of the door plug blowout on January 5th.
My fellow witnesses and I felt that it would be useful to expand on several of the key recommendations in our report, as this may help set the stage for today's hearing. First and foremost is one that has been talked about since the report came out, is our finding that there exists a disconnect, for lack of a better word, between the words that are being said by Boeing management and what is being seen and experienced by employees across the company. They hear, safety is our number one priority. But what they see is that that's only true as long as your production milestones are met. And at that point, it's push it out the door as fast as you can. They hear, speak up if you see anything that's unsafe. But what they see is that if they do speak up, they get very little feedback. And if they insist, they may find themselves on the short end of the stick next time raises or bonuses or job transfers come up, or even worse. We found this disconnect to be present at almost all levels and at all work sites that we visited. We heard it from technicians, we heard it from engineers, and we heard it, more concerning, from members of the ODA that are delegated by the FAA to conduct inspections and tests on behalf of the government. To me, it is clear that the commitment to change, the level of change, and the pace of change at Boeing is not commensurate with the events that created the need for all this change in the first place, namely the two fatal crashes of two brand new airplanes 5 years ago. It was distressing to read a recent statement by Brian West, the CFO of Boeing, speaking about the Alaska Air incidents from this past January, where he said, for years, and this is a quote, for years we prioritized the movement of the airplane through the factory over getting it done right. That's got to change. The leadership team got it in the immediate aftermath of January 5th. Now, I would have thought that they would have gotten it 5 years ago.
You know, it wasn't always like this at Boeing. And it's actually pretty easy to pinpoint when the culture at the company started to turn. In 1997, Boeing bought a rival airplane manufacturer, McDonnell Douglas. But instead of the Boeing executives staying in charge, leaders who had previously spared no expense to ensure that Boeing planes were the best in the world. But after the merger, the McDonnell Douglas executives essentially took over Boeing. It's a joke in the industry that McDonnell Douglas bought Boeing with Boeing's money. Because after that merger, the new executives prioritized Boeing's stock price above all else, which meant that excellence in engineering took a back seat to cost cutting, so that as much money as possible could be funneled to shareholders. The CEO of McDonnell Douglas, who eventually became the CEO of Boeing, Harry Stonecipher, said, quote, "When people say I changed the culture of Boeing, that was the intent. So it's run like a business rather than a great engineering firm," unquote. Well, mission accomplished. Boeing is a great engineering firm no more. And its current prioritization of enriching investors who play no role in making the planes at the expense of safety has led to a prioritization of speed instead of quality. It has led to global outsourcing. It has led to minimal inspections and crashes and cover-ups. But Boeing couldn't have gotten away with any of it had there been effective policing. So where was the FAA for the last 3 decades? How did the FAA let it get this bad? Well, here's Ed Pearson, the Boeing manager turned whistleblower, and Joe Jacobson, who's the former Boeing employee and then former FAA certification engineer, speaking to Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut.
2 brand new airplanes crashed after exhibiting production-related electrical and electronic defects within their first month of operation, and the NTSB did not investigate the factory. The evidence indicates the MAX crashes were triggered by manufacturing defects, not MCAS software. The NTSB is investigating the factory now. However, the reality is the NTSB is overly dependent on Boeing and the FAA to provide technical assistance in their accident investigations. They are not an independent investigative authority. There is an inherent conflict of interest.
Well, certainly having more inspectors is helpful in certain circumstances. I think in the Renton factory, having more inspectors, more of an on-site presence is very important. But the attitude needs to change. The attitude right now is Boeing dictates to the FAA, tells the FAA what they will do, what they will accept, and that needs to change. The FAA needs to be a regulator. They need to do their job, and that's the missing piece right now.
Would it be fair to say that the FAA has been too captive to Boeing?
They absolutely have been too captive to Boeing, and that is one of the big problems that I've seen. Even when we were trying to recertify the 737 MAX, Boeing would try and focus the attention on certain things like MCAS to the exclusion of other parts of the airplane or the design or the manufacturing that needed to be investigated. And Boeing and the FAA went along with that at high levels. They went along with that, the redirect from the Boeing company.
The FAA issued an absolutely scathing report about Boeing, and Boeing has said that it's developing an action plan. I'd like to ask you, Mr. Pearson, should we rely on Boeing to, in effect, develop its own action plan, evaluate itself, and go on about its business? Or do we need continuing investigation?
We absolutely need continuing investigation. And honestly, I'm so tired of hearing about plans. We need action. And you can plan all day long, but if you don't actually carry through with it, it doesn't matter.
So basically, we have another example of regulatory capture, of businesses being allowed to police themselves in a government that has been prioritizing freedom for businesses for decades. This is what deregulation looks like. Deregulation is not just a cool damn the man slogan. Deregulation has consequences. But Congress has at least begun to attempt to force the Federal Aviation Administration to do its job. Because the Aircraft Certification Safety and Accountability Act was dingleberried into law as part of the over 2,000-page government funding law, the Omnibus, that was signed by President Trump during COVID Christmas week in 2020. And it required reforms to the aircraft certification process designed to limit how much the FAA can delegate certification responsibilities to the companies who are seeking certification. In other words, ACSA was designed to limit the extent to which Boeing is allowed to govern itself. And it was this new law, ACSA, that created the panel of experts that you've heard from today. The expert panel read over 4,000 Boeing documents and conducted more than 250 interviews with Boeing employees in 6 company locations. And in their final report, the expert panel made 53 recommendations for how Boeing should improve to ensure our safety on their planes. Those recommendations are then supposed to be enforced by the FAA. And so the question right now is, will the FAA enforce them? And the answer is that we don't know. But there is a new FAA administrator, Michael Whitaker. He's a lawyer who worked for United Airlines for almost 15 years, and so he has that corporate mole red flag in his resume. But more recently, he has worked at the FAA as a regulator. And then he also worked for a relatively small electric airplane manufacturer, which is a subsidiary of Hyundai. And now he's the FAA administrator. But he didn't ever work for Boeing or as a lobbyist for Boeing, so I guess that's good. And to try to get a feel for his approach in governing, I watched a hearing with him. I put the link to the full hearing in the show notes for you. But in the hearing, Whitaker said all the right things. He made a lot of promises, but I don't think his promises are all that important to hear right now. Because I'm more interested in action, specifically the FAA acting as a regulator, as a policeman, and not a rubber stamp. And only time will tell if his promises will become actions. But the promises have been made, and he's new, so we have to give him a little bit of time to prove that he's going to do his job. But like I said, he said all the right things. But they always do. But there is one action that he said is being taken right now that genuinely makes me feel at least a eensy-weensy bit better. Here's Senator John Tester speaking to our new FAA Administrator, Michael Whitaker.
What's going on in the FAA? Why are these kind of failures happening?
So we did not have the inspectors on the ground in the factories before January 5th. So that's a change.
Why is that?
It was largely viewed as an audit process to make sure that the quality assurance programs were being executed and the appropriate paperwork was in place.
So post-January 5th, the rules of the road have changed?
That's correct.
Okay. And so that's good, by the way. I think that's very, very good. So when the inspection is done now, they are people that report directly to you?
Absolutely.
They have no connection with Boeing whatsoever?
That's correct, and that is a change. And I've met with those employees. They go around, they talk to the Boeing employees, they conduct audits, they verify work's been done. We started with about 24. We're up to about 36 now, and we're going to get up to a higher number going forward.
And are those 36 Boeing-specific inspectors, or is that overall inspectors that were hired by the FAA?
These are inspectors that we have moved to the Boeing facilities and also to the Spirit facility.
And long-term, how many inspectors do you think you're going to need for that to be able to be where you think the safety violations, or whatever you want to call them, are that you're comfortable that Boeing's doing what they need to do to put out a superior product, by the way, like they used to do?
Right. Our current target is 55, but we will adjust that as we go forward based on need.
So, it's a good first step. Important first step, but just a first step. Here's MIT's Dr. DeLuise from the expert panel, followed by Boeing's whistleblower Sam Salahpour and Joe Jacobson, who worked for Boeing and the FAA, being questioned by Senator Maggie Hassan of New Hampshire.
I'll note that for the last 20 years, every FAA Reauthorization Act pushed more and more responsibility over the fence to the manufacturer's side. At the time, this was done with the understandable objective of increasing efficiency and productivity. The two MAX crashes showed that the pendulum had swung too far, and AXA was the response to try to correct this. But AXA cannot be the high watermark in your efforts. I urge you, as you debate additional steps that can be taken to ensure that you increase the FAA oversight of Boeing and that you keep pushing for structural change at the company, and as well as ensuring that all of our panel's 53 recommendations are fully implemented. Believe that this is the only way that we can return this company to what we all remember it once being, a company known for engineering excellence, and a company where the headlines were written about it because of its accomplishments and not because of its failures. I believe the flying public deserves no less.
So another question for you, sir. In 2020, Congress reformed safety and certification requirements for aircraft manufacturers following the 737 MAX disasters. What was your experience with how those reforms were implemented and whether Boeing appropriately followed them?
My personal opinion, from what I've seen from bottom up, it's been nothing.
And Mr. Jacobson, as a former FAA official, do you have any thoughts about how effective that agency was in implementing and overseeing those reforms?
The attitude from day one was not good at upper levels of the FAA. The message that I heard right after AXA was passed was, we're already doing all of this. So that's the wrong attitude from day one. Mm-hmm. And then what I saw, I tracked a lot of the implementation of AXA, working with Senator Cantwell's office. And what I saw there was kind of a half-hearted look at all of these recommendations and requirements. They tended to lump them all together.
Yeah.
And called them work streams and said, we've got that covered. That's in this work stream or that work stream. And instead of taking each individual provision very seriously and attacking them, that was not the attitude. Yeah, I'm hopeful that Mr. Whitaker, the new FAA administrator, will really take on the challenge of changing the culture at the FAA so that FAA is back to doing their job as a regulator. If they just rubber stamp everything that the manufacturers do, then it's really they're not doing anything useful. And so we need to get back to them doing a useful job as regulators.
So there's still a long way to go before I'm going to feel entirely safe on a Boeing airplane, which is a shame because I, as a frequent flyer, can't remember the last time I got on an airplane in the United States and it wasn't a Boeing. When we allow monopolies or duopolies, they're tough to escape. And so how am I going to protect myself knowing what I know now? Well, first of all, I'm going to keep flying because regardless of everything we heard today, flying is still the safest way to travel in a country that doesn't have a high-speed rail network. Driving by far remains the most dangerous way to travel, and here are the statistics backing that up. Your odds of dying in a plane crash, even after the 2018 and 2019 crashes, are 1 in 11 million. Your odds of dying in a car crash are 1 in 5,000. Which means that the most dangerous part of your airplane travel day is driving to and from the airport. But I understand that that's not much solace when sitting on a plane, and so another thing that you can do to somewhat protect yourself is sit in the back of the plane. Sam Salapor's testimony about the 787 was about bolts that are in the front of the plane. That's what they were pointing to in the diagram that Senator Wicker held up. And so, sit in the back. Your likelihood of survival of any plane accident has been proven time and time again to be significantly higher in the back of the plane anyway. And finally, you can avoid the seats next to the door plugs. These are the seats where a door could have been installed but wasn't. But you can still tell from the inside where those not-a-doors are if you look for them. So inside the plane, you're going to notice that the walls are divided into segments, and most of the segments are a couple of rows wide. But some of them are only as wide as a single row. Those are the door plug rows. Don't sit there. The reason no one died when the door plug flew off of the Alaska Airlines flight is because that row was empty. But there were people sitting both behind and in front of the door plug who had their seatbelts fastened and who were not sucked out of the plane. And I'm sure those people were scared shitless, but in the grand scheme of things, they were just fine. But aside from becoming a hermit and never going anywhere, that's about the best you can do to protect yourself from the problems identified within Boeing. There are just some problems that only corporations and the governments who police them can solve. And this is one of those situations. Which is why we should vote for people who want our government to function. Deregulation for the sake of deregulation, allowing businesses to govern themselves, it's not cool. It's dangerous. And the best thing we can do, big picture, is to start to value our government, especially government in its role as big business police. Because government is the only entity on earth powerful enough to police big businesses. And we need a government committed to doing it well. So every single producer of Congressional Dish is extremely important to me because I know that podcasts are free and you don't have to pay for them. So people who voluntarily pay for this show that participate in the value for value business model in where I produce episodes that have value in them. So like this episode, I gave you all the information that I could about Boeing so that you can act on it in a bunch of different ways. You can decide where you sit on a plane using this information, or you can reach out to your members of Congress and be a lobbyist in your own right and advocate for what you want them to do about Boeing. And also, just to give you this testimony, like I said earlier, this was about 20 hours of testimony. A lot of it boring. A lot of it I wasn't able to use in this episode. But I was able to pick out the most interesting parts and rearrange them for you so that you can understand the storylines. It takes a lot of work, and I think there's value in that. And so if you agree that there's value in that, the part of this business model where you come in is that you pay for this show voluntarily. And thank you to every single person that does. You are a producer of this show. You are essential to the show. But there are some producers that have decided to take it to the next level and become executive producers. Executive producers are people that have paid $535, which was actually a number that was invented by one of our executive producers named Mike Coverdale. And the idea behind the $535 is that that is $1 for every member of Congress. And every time you hit that $535, you get to claim an executive producer credit and put it on an episode of your choice. And that essentially acts as your vouch for that episode. And the reason that's important is that on congressionaldish.com, we have a list of most valuable episodes. Because when new people come to this show, I mean, there's 12 years worth of episodes, and they want to know which are the ones that they should listen to first. And so that list is where I send them. And so the episodes that they are going to see on the top of the list are the ones that have the most executive producer credits on it. And so today I would like to thank Tariq Leu. He is our executive producer on Congressional Dish 292, Sabotaging Palestine, which I'm so happy to see that move up the list because I think it's one of the most important episodes I've ever done. And with his executive producer credit, he sent in a message. He said, "Hi, Jen, another incredible episode. I would love to be an EP on 292. I appreciate your diligence and thoughtfulness in discussing these topics. Thanks for your hard work, Tariq Leu." And thank you so much for supporting this show at the executive producer level and moving that episode up the list because the war in Gaza continues, and I think we need to know the details about how we are participating in the destruction of Gaza, and that is the episode that gives that information. So thank you so much for moving that up the list. And like I said, that 535 number that we have determined as our executive producer threshold, it was invented by a guy named Mike Coverdale, who is an executive producer of this show, has been for a very long time. And in his honor, I'm going to break one of my rules, which is that I don't endorse candidates for office in general. I don't bring very many on the show. I brought a personal friend of mine who had run for Congress on the show once. And then way back in the day, I interviewed someone who had run for Congress, but he wasn't running for Congress at the time. But that's as far as I go. And in my inbox, if you were allowed in my inbox, you would see that I have gotten dozens of requests from people who are running for office and either want to come on the show or want to pay me to have them as a guest on the show or want me to mention them on the show. And I ignore every single one of those emails, except for one, because I got an email recently from Mike Coverdale. And Mike is one of us. Mike has been a member of the Congressional Dish community for so many years. And so I actually do want to tell you about his candidacy because he is running for state office. So he's not running for Congress. He's starting with Washington State. And this felt like an appropriate episode to tell you about his candidacy on, since Boeing is headquartered in Washington State. And one of the lobbyists that I told you about that is running around the Capitol trying to tell our members of Congress to do things for Boeing, he was a representative for Washington's 6th District. And I just kind of find it wild that Mike Coverdale of the Congressional Dish community, is running for the 6th District of Washington State. So there are just all these signs that I should break my rules and tell you about him. But basically, in my interactions with Mike over many years, he's a good dude, and he stands for the same things we do. He doesn't want to have money in politics, and he's against, the military-industrial complex and unnecessary wars. And you can actually go and check out his website for yourself. This is a website that I think is quite well done as he lays out his issues, and a lot of candidates don't do that. I can't tell you how many times I've gone to a website and they just don't tell you where they stand on things, but Mike does. And so I just wanted to give you his website. It is Mike19.com. That's Mike19, like the numbers, Mike19.com. And that's where you can go and check out his candidacy and support it if you want to. But I just wanted to say that I'm very proud of this community, and I am very proud that a member of this community is running for office and said that this podcast was an inspiration for doing so. And so if you value that too, this is one of those things where I've complained, because I'm a whiner, quite a few times that I just don't know that this show is making a difference. But the fact that this in any way inspired Mike's candidacy inspires me to keep going with this podcast, knowing that it is making a difference in some way. And so, Mike Coverdale, I want to wish you the best of luck in your run for your state representation. I think Washington would be well served to have a member of the Congressional Dish community representing it. So good luck. And again, his website is Mike19.com. All right, that's it for today. I am going to be heading to the Republican National Convention. entirely sure what I'm going to do there. But if you are curious about anything that's happening at the Republican National Convention, please tweet me at Jen Briney, because I do still have a Twitter obsession. And I know it has a different name now. I don't give a shit. I'm calling it Twitter. If you have any questions and you want me to do an episode about what I'm seeing at the Republican National Convention, please tweet me your questions while that is going on, and I will do my best to answer them. But I don't exactly know what kind of episode I can make out of that because I have no idea what to expect from this convention. It's going to be the first time I've been at anything like this. I'm quite excited that I am credentialed as a real-ass journalist. I had to go through a whole process and get credentialed by the House of Representatives. So, this is definitely helping with my imposter syndrome to have the House of Representatives give me the stamp of approval. Like, yes, you are a real journalist. So that's pretty exciting. And we are doing a We're Not Wrong live podcast on June 19th. That's a Friday night at 7 p.m. So if you're in the Milwaukee area, please come to that. And then we never give the location ahead of time because you have to come to our actual show to find out. But myself, Justin, and Andrew, we always hang out afterwards with the people who attend. And so we will go into a bar and hang out with you. So please come to that event. So we'll just see what happens at a convention. I'm sure I'll be grossed out by it. At the very least, I will do an episode about it on Patreon. I don't know if it's going to be worthy of a full congressional dish, but at the very least, I will be telling people on Patreon. So if you want to hear anything about the convention and what that's like, please support the show on Patreon, and I will let you know what goes on. All right, thanks so much for listening, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, if the end will justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.